I'm struggling with ways to how we can awaken people to the reality that our leaders can harm others. Part of the reason I say awaken people to that is that's one of the reasons I think people end up siding with the leader and blaming the victim. It's a path of least resistance. It reduces cognitive dissonance. I'm getting this information that someone's abused, and surely they didn't do that. And how did it happen on our watch? Why am I a part of a community where this did happen? It brings up some really deep questions about my own, if you will, participation in this. So instead of facing those kinds of questions, it's just an easier path to side with an abusive leader. So we've got a lot of work to do, honestly, to prevent this and respond better. But if we do, I think we're going to be using power effectively to center survivors instead of protect leaders. It's not just this isolated thing that we need to just go hide away somewhere. We really are all impacted.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Broken to Beloved podcast. If you're looking for compassionate conversations that provide practical resources to move toward healing and wholeness, this is the place for you. Today, we're talking with Dr. David Pooler about his research on clergy sexual abuse over the last 10 years and what we can learn about it. I want to provide a general content and trigger warning. This is such a sensitive topic. Please be gentle with yourself and feel free to turn this off or skip the episode entirely if you don't have the capacity to listen right now. Dr. Pooler has more than 15 years of social work practice experience with several different populations, including at-risk and abused children, adults with severe and persistent mental illness, persons with addictions, and homeless men. He also has a strong interest in developing healthy congregations so that they can transform communities. Dr. Pooler is a professor at Baylor University and part of the Diana R. Garland School of Social Work. Here is my conversation with our new friend, David. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited for this conversation. Thank you for your work. I learned about you from the All the Buried Women podcast with Savannah and Beth, and I just knew that I needed to reach out. For those who may be unfamiliar with you or your work, would you just share a little bit about what you do?
Sure. So I'm a professor of social work at Baylor University in the Diana R. Garland School of Social Work, and I'm finishing my 16th year here. So I'm primarily a social work educator. And I also do research as a part of my job. And part of what I've spent, especially the past decade, doing is studying adult clergy sexual abuse, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Sure is.
But I've also studied some things around just flourishing and joy and the health of professionals, specifically social workers, which kind of informed my work on adult clergy sexual abuse. The other thing that listeners might want to know about me is I'm also a therapist. I don't do it full-time, but I do it part-time. And it informs my teaching, and it also informs my research, because as a licensed clinical social worker in Texas, I can also treat survivors of adult clergy sexual abuse. So the people that I work with are not exclusively survivors. Many of them are. And so I've gained additional insights about this particular issue from actually working with survivors directly and treating them and working with them as their therapist. So That's a brief overview of kind of who I am and what I do.
So you come at it with the academic side of it, but also with the data, the research, the actual practice in working with people.
Yes.
10 years ago, you mentioned the data and the kind of the stuff around clergy sexual abuse. How did you get started there?
That's a great question. And that takes me back even all the way back to when I was a doctoral student at the University of Louisville. I was really actually interested in ministers whose practice was impaired in some way, like their mental health issues or something else was interfering with their effectiveness in ministry. And my social work training kind of broadened me out beyond just looking at the individual, but systems and structures and, kind of what's happening with people. And then as a social worker also, I realized if I'm going to understand kind of more about the impact of ministry on people, let's talk about the way that people have actually been impacted. So my social work training kind of got me into thinking about the survivors as the primary place to start. For example, if I want to deal with white supremacy, I don't go and talk with white leaders about what it necessarily looks like to dismantle that. I need to actually go to people of color and understand what dismantling that might look like from their perspective. So in the same way, I don't go to the leaders of organizations that might be perpetrating, abuse. I want to go to survivors and understand their experiences. One other thing about how I got into this is that was early on, and I actually had to pivot away from kind of looking at impaired ministers because I was doing my dissertation work starting in '02. And for folks acquainted with a little bit of modern church history, that's when the Boston Globe broke the major stories up in the Northeast of when, priests were abusing kids and our archbishops were moving people around and, not dealing with it and confronting it. So my committee said, hey, David, let's maybe look at something else. And so that got me in looking at kind of professionals more broadly about kind of peer support and wellness and ethics and boundaries and kind of the challenges that professionals have. So that really did lay the foundation. When I got to Baylor in '09, I got the chance to work with Diana Garland herself, who'd been doing some amazing work in this area from '05 all the way up to her death in 2015. And so it was around the time of her death when I did a national study a decade ago that really got me launched into this area. And if you look at the timing of that, that was prior to Me Too. It was prior to Church Too. We weren't really talking a lot in a broad way about spiritual abuse and certainly not adult clergy sexual abuse, at least in any kind of national way. There was no attention being given to it. Social media was maybe a decade old at that point. But anyway, that's kind of a background of how I got into that. And so really, since 2015, I've primarily focused on this area.
And we're definitely going to get into the research, the data, the surveys. Sure. You do so much work there. But I want to set the stage for people or set the table for people who are listening to have an idea of where you're coming from. This stuck out to me that your email signature has this quote from Martin Luther King. Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. What does that mean to you, and why do you include it?
Wow. I guess on some level, this is interesting. Martin Luther King Jr. has always been someone I've been drawn to. I've been a bit of an iconoclast all the way back in undergrad. I was doing a religion major, and I was asked to kind of focus on someone preaching and teaching. And I just was like, I'm going to go after Martin Luther King Jr. So I guess all the way since undergrad, not that I'm an expert on his life or his work or his writings or anything, but I've always been drawn to them. And something else about him that I've been drawn to is kind of this idea of having a tender heart and a tough mind. And it's something he actually talks about. So I've just wanted to emulate some of that. And I feel like this intersection of spiritual abuse and particularly adult clergy sexual abuse requires that, a really tender heart of understanding people and where they are and what their needs are and being trauma sensitive, but the tough mind of critically analyzing and digging deep into sort of what's going on. How does this happen? Why does it happen? And then speaking directly and clearly about that. So that's what I've attempted to do, as I guess both kind of bring together all of me as a teacher, a researcher, and a clinician. I try to integrate all of that together. So going back to the quote you said, I guess part of it is love really is about justice. They're intertwined to me. And the work that I'm doing, it does feel like it's justice work. And it's also loving people. It's loving the church. It's loving people that abuse. It's about loving people who've been abused. And, people are injured in relationship and people heal in relationship. And so I'm hoping my research is just informing that entire space. I'll just say this, the area where I think the church is most lacking around all of this, and I don't know why my brain's just going there after the question, but it's just around justice, where so few churches really have a grid, a rubric, a plan, a process, a way of leaning into helping people heal. especially when there's been an injury on the watch or perpetrated by a leader. To me, faith communities could be leading the way and kind of culture changers around that. But I feel like, in my observation, the church actually lags behind secular institutions and secular leaders, if you will. Even to make that divide might be artificial, but I feel like the institution of the church as a whole lags behind, isn't leading the way in restorative justice practices, or leading the way of what it looks like to make wrongs right, or acknowledging, hey, we've done something that's injured somebody. We're really sorry. Now we're going to really work to make that right and show you how that's actually done.
Agreed. Well, and you mentioned the word integrate, and I think that put the light bulb on for me, because as I was reading the quote and just kind of imagining where you might go with it, the word I kept struggling with was balance. And I was like, it's not balance. It's not like putting these two things, power and love, on a scale and hoping that one wins out of the other or that they come out equal, but it's an integration of all of those things together, of power and love and justice and all of these things that can be integrated and aren't meant to be pitted against each other, right?
Absolutely.
But that integration into who we are and the way that we live life. So I love that approach. Thank you.
Sure.
You conducted a national survey in 2015 of adult clergy sexual abuse survivors. You mentioned a little bit with the 2002 Boston Globe story, doing your doctoral work, your dissertation, all of this stuff. What prompted that survey? And we'll spend a lot of time about what did you find?
Yeah, the story of that is really actually fascinating. There was a survivor from California who reached out to my mentor, Diana Garland, and said, I'd like to do some research. Can you all sort of help set me up to do this? And Diana Garland, I think, wisely said, hey, quite frankly, if you do this study and it's known you're a survivor, there are going to be naysayers who are going to discredit your findings, simply saying this person's, biased. They're drawing conclusions based on their own experience. And so, in short, she basically said, hey, we could do this survey with you kind of being a consultant with us and kind of supporting us as we get this set up. And I honestly, when I was sort of hearing about all this, I assumed Diana Garland was going to run with this and I would maybe support her. And she said, hey, David, why don't you run with this? And so I was like, wow. So my mentor had sort of said, hey, take this, run with this. Why don't you do the study? So that's exactly what we did. So, developed a set of items based on some of Diana Garland's work, some of the review of the literature, some input from the survivor, what kinds of things, what questions she had, and basically just wanted to broadly understand the survivor herself, what was going on in her world, what the church was like, where it happened, and certainly what the perpetrator was like, who were they, and then I think lastly, how did the church respond? So that's broadly what we were attempting to get at in that survey.
Thank you. I think I read or heard somewhere that you got 283 survivors from 42 states. And for those who are not familiar with like academic surveys and research and data and all that kind of stuff, tell us about those 283 people.
So one of the things that people often ask is, where do you go and find survivors to even complete a survey? Well, at the time, 10 years ago, and it still exists today, it's called the Hope of Survivors. It was kind of a survivor support network that was online. They had regular interface. People could get some support there, even with mental health things, but more referrals than anything. But it was one of the only places that I was aware of. There was another one called Faith Trust Institute. Marie Fortune actually started that and was probably one of the first people out of the gate to ever address this topic in 1989. But the Faith Trust Institute was beyond just adult clergy sex abuse survivors. It dealt with domestic violence and interpersonal violence in the church and other kinds of challenges. But basically what I did is I used those two places as what we would call a sampling frame. So, I'll just say this, there are clear limits to that also, because there are survivors who would not be a part of either one of those networks, who would never necessarily get the invitation. So what we did is we targeted those two places with an invitation to be a part of the online survey, and then allowed people what we call to snowball it, like, hey, if you know someone else who has had this experience, who's not in this network, feel free to, send this link on to them. And so I even had a question, where did you get the link? And so about 80% got it through either Faith Trust Institute or Hope of Survivors.
Okay.
So another 20% got it sent to them in another way. But is that representative? I'll just say this, Brian. So is this representative of all survivors? Probably not, especially if the folks that were out there kind of didn't want anything to do with faith or church at all.
Right.
Because these two networks at least had some faith connection. You didn't have to check a box and say, I believe certain things to be a part of them. But there's clearly a limitation that we didn't get people who might not, who've just sort of rejected faith altogether and just walked away. But yeah, so we got about almost 300 people who responded to that. I will say that only a little over half of those people completed all the items. So what that actually is telling us is that there were a number of people that this was really hard for them. Maybe just looking at the items, recalling the events of their experience of adult clergy sexual abuse was really painful. So they dropped out. So they completed some of the items. So we have really, completed, total surveys for about 160 folks. And so most of the data that I present are off of those. I'm going to do some more research this year, and there are many more survivor networks available at this point in time, a decade later, with more awareness, more conversations and social media that are happening around this.
Thank you. And I can't imagine 10 years ago the courage it would have taken. And you mentioned like people who drop out of the survey because maybe it was too much or they're unable to finish answering all the questions. I know for people that I hear from or people who are in our community, how hard it is for them to speak up or to share their story until they feel safe, until they recognize, oh, there's someone else and I'm not the only one, or that there's going to be some kind of support within there. So I'm excited to hear about you getting ready to do another survey. But let's talk about the results from that one 10 years ago, because these are some startling statistics, and I imagine they may be even more true today. I have plenty of questions of my own, but where would you like to start?
Sure. I think I'll start with something from a recent manuscript that just got published in the journal called Traumatology. I'm the second author on it. I collaborated with a friend and a scholar, Sandra Moncrief Stewart. But what we found is of those 160 folks, we included in that survey 10 years ago a screen for post-traumatic stress disorder.
That's where I was hoping you'd go.
And because I think this is one of the most salient pieces of the research. So it's basically a screen. And then technically what one would do is if I were a clinician, I would give this as a screen to my client, and then I would confirm or deny the screen. But what it did is it screened positive 39% of those 160 women. And that's really significant because when I scour the literature, I have now actually found one place where PTSD rates are a little bit higher, and that's women in the military with military sexual trauma. Very similar environment to the church in the sense where leaders might be protected. It's kind of hierarchical. It's kind of a closed system. You have to continue to interface potentially with the person who abused you. And in one study I saw PTSD levels as high as 45%, so 6% higher in military sexual trauma. But I could not find any other subsample, if you will, of the population where PTSD levels were as high as 39%. Even looking at a big global study in 2017 around sexual assault broadly, women who'd been sexually assaulted, that was around 20%, 1 in 5. That was a little bit higher, but not as high as 39% in some other cases where there were other complex issues at play from their childhood. But I think one of the things, my big takeaway on that 39% is the PTSD isn't just the injury from being targeted and sexually abused by a leader misusing their power, but it's also from the response from the religious institution or the church. Because what we're often seeing is a really poor and inadequate response to the injuries. Not believing the survivor, not really supporting the survivor, continuing to protect or platform the leader. And what we know, and what I know from talking with survivors, is that kind of ongoing platforming of someone who's been abusive is really damaging. It just erodes their sense of trust or the sense that the church is going to do the right thing or even cares about the right thing to do. So we know it's just a complex cluster of factors at play that's probably creating that 39% PTSD. One other thing I would add to that cluster is that, faith communities mediate so much in someone's life, that, meaning, purpose, social support, friendships, all of that kind of happens in that space. And so when there's something that disrupts that or fractures that or, disconnects you fully from being able to participate in that or trust that, there's a major, major injury. So I think that's one of probably the biggest takeaways so far from that study, the data that I got 10 years ago. And again, as you're hearing, some of that's still being published even right now, still coming out. I'm still kind of working with those data.
Well, and the 39% was so significant, I think, in part when you compare it to, like you were saying, PTSD for survivors coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan being at, I think you said it was at 30%?
That's right. Yeah, I looked at several different studies out of the VA kind of looking at that. So what we're saying then is even people who've been in a combat theater, who've been exposed to that kind of trauma, their PTSD levels are actually lower than adult clergy sex abuse survivors.
And there are so many reasons for that. You talk about betrayal blindness, institutional betrayal, and all these other factors that come into play. You talked about how not only are you carrying the trauma of this thing happening to you in that environment, in a place where you thought you would be safe, where you should be safe and cared for and all these things, and then you've got all the power dynamics at play, and then the institution or the people around you, your community, don't even believe you. And it's just tragic the way that this plays out time and time again.
It is. And one of the things that I'm just going to piggyback on kind of this piece about the community itself. I'm struggling with ways to how we can awaken people to the reality that our leaders can harm others.
Yeah.
And part of the reason I say awaken people to that is that that's one of the reasons I think people end up siding with the leader and blaming the victim, kind of going along with that. It's a path of least resistance. It reduces cognitive dissonance. I'm getting this information that someone's abused, and I mean, surely they didn't do that. And oh my God, surely, they were tempted by they're trying to fill in the space of how can this happen? Why does it happen? How did it happen on our watch? Why am I a part of a community where this did happen? It brings up some really deep questions about my own, if you will, participation in this. Could I have seen it? Should I have known it? Why am I at this church? How did I, in a sense, trust this leader? How did I not see it? So instead of facing those kinds of questions, it's just an easier path to side with an abusive leader. And I wish we weren't there, but that appears to be where we still are. Although I will say in 2025, I am hopeful that we're starting to make a little bit of progress in this area where there's more awareness, there are more people talking. And again, just being on this podcast is a gift not only for people in churches, because I think when we live in reality, we're much better able to live and love and respond and protect. When we see things as they actually are, not as we wish them to be, which is sometimes where we end up living, is sort of an idealized view of what church is and about who my neighbor is and this faith community I'm a part of. It's an idealized version. So we've got a lot of work to do, honestly, to prevent this and respond better. But if we do, I think we're going to be using power effectively, right? To center survivors instead of protect leaders. We're going to love all people in a way of understanding the exact nature of the injuries that have happened and the fact that there's so many secondary survivors, the spouses of those people, friends, others, were all impacted. It's not just this isolated thing that we need to just go hide away somewhere. We really are all impacted. And I think that if we can awaken to the fact that we actually have leaders that can harm, we do a better job as treating them as human and doing a much better job responding broadly when injuries happen. We would be just healthier, and we would have paths forward that actually make sense. It'd be messy, it would be complex, it would be really, really hard. But when we lean into those spaces, I think we see some of the best outcomes.
Absolutely. I recently finished Blind to Betrayal by Jennifer Freed. And, you talk about institutional betrayal is when institutions harm those who are dependent on them or fail to respond supportively to wrongdoings within the institution. And it was such an important book for me in understanding why, like you said, people within our churches or congregations choose to side with the leader. They have too much time, energy, finances invested in this one place. It's where my family grew up. It's where I grew up. This pastor did so many important things for me or significant things. It's like they literally can't see the moments where the memories just kind of get whooshed away, right? The stories get whooshed away of, oh, well, this person very clearly harmed my friend, my family member, whatever it is, but I don't know how to process that information, so I will choose not to see it.
Right.
Tell us what you've learned about institutional betrayal and how that affects what we're talking about.
Right. Jennifer Freyd talks about institutional courage versus institutional betrayal. She kind of puts that on a continuum. Institutional courage, if we kind of take the positive tack, is doing the right thing. It's acknowledging when a harm has happened. Certainly it's, first of all, just trying to prevent harm from happening, really in good faith, trying to prevent harm. But when it does happen, it's centering the person who's been harmed. In other words, believing them, caring about them, including them, continuing to protect them, not making them, in a sense, interface with the abuser, learning what has happened to them. But I think some of the most important things in institutional courage is including them in what should happen as far as what does justice look like? What do you feel like should happen to the leader? It doesn't mean that you just do whatever the survivor says, but at least it includes them and actively involves them so that they feel like they're participating in the process. So to the extent that they want to be named or not named, to the extent they want to be involved or not involved. And when they do want to be involved, involving them as much as it's actually feasible. And for the most part, we're not doing those things,
right,
which then leads us into institutional betrayal, which is basically when there's a betrayal injury that is often ongoing because the response from an institution isn't generally a one-time thing. It's often an ongoing response to what has happened that continues to injure the survivor. Because on some level, there's several things happening. Not being believed, not being, the survivor not being included in the process, the survivor injuries not being seen, understood, or validated. And certainly at worst, continuing to platform and elevate or keep in ministry someone who's harmed. And, another piece, what we would say is around investigations. There are now more and more groups or agencies and organizations that do third-party investigations. And I honestly think that when these kinds of injuries occur, you should bring in a third party because churches, they have a conflict of interest. They're trying to do a couple things all at the same time. And some of that is manage the damage and manage their reputation. Because sometimes there's this sense of we've got to look good to society. We've got to look good to our community. Well, when these kind of things happen, you don't look good and you just need to own it. But in that attempt to kind of manage perception and image, a lot of damage can occur. So that's why I think we ought to bring in a third party. Not bringing in that third party as a part of the equation. So in sum, it's when the institution's response is inadequate in some way, and it generally occurs sort of over time in ways that continue to injure the person who had already been harmed by an abusive leader. So you've got a double layered injury. And I even asked a question in my survey that said, the way that I've been treated by the church is worse than the abuse itself. So I have 30% strongly agreeing and 20% agreeing. So 50%.
Oh my goodness.
So 50% strongly agreed or agreed with that statement.
Wow.
And at the time this came out, the term institutional betrayal was pretty new, and I had not quite encountered it, honestly, in the literature to include an actual measure. And I think at that point, Jennifer and colleagues, they were beginning to develop an instrument to measure it. But this one question kind of got at it at a broad level. So, half of the people agreeing and strongly agreeing that that response from the church was worse than the abuse itself. And that was really telling. And I had only learned that from Diana Garland. She had interviewed some survivors, and she had kind of shared with me that that's what she was hearing. So I thought, hey, I need to include an item like that in the survey.
Yeah, that is, again, just tragic to hear that. And you ask other questions and share other statistics that only 7% of survivors said their church had a policy in place at all to support them. Only 33% said when they reported that they were believed, that 2/3 of survivors were not even believed, and that only 9% of said that the church was helpful when they reported the abuse. There are so many solid numbers based on your data and your research to share where we were 10 years ago in terms of institutional response. And I quite frankly don't have much hope that the numbers have gotten much better today based on the amount of stories and reports that we are hearing coming out, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. There is just so much going on. And I love that you mentioned the kind of spectrum of institutional courage to institutional betrayal. And I think when you talk about the institutional courage, it reminds me also a lot of the work of Judith Herman, right? Was it The Truth in Repair, I think was the last one. And involving the victims or involving the survivors in the process of justice. What does it look like to the extent that you want to be involved, right? What measures of repair? And so often it's not that they wanted vengeance. It's not that they wanted the person to be ousted from their position or their job. It's like, I just want to be believed. I want someone to say that, yes, this happened to you and yes, this was wrong.
That's absolutely right. One of the things I didn't mention is that I followed up with that survey and interviewed 27 survivors in the maybe 3 months after the survey closed. That's when I really began to get it. Like the findings were contextualized by those stories that I had gotten. The reason I bring that up is because what I've realized is one of the only ways that people find justice, and it's quite incomplete, is to actually do a lawsuit against the church. Yeah. Now, I can just say this unequivocally. I have not met a survivor yet that was what they really wanted. That is not what they wanted. They did not want to sue the church, but they realized the church had no pathway. There was no starting point. There was no way to get a sort of a hook into the rock. It's like there's nowhere to go. The institution has nothing in place to hold itself accountable. So my only option to even get a semblance or measure of justice, or for the church to acknowledge a wrongdoing or to be held accountable in any way, was to do a lawsuit. Yeah. And at the end of the day, every survivor that I know that's ever gotten a settlement said the money is in it. That's not it. That doesn't do anything. It's like, I'm glad I have it, but no. I would much rather see the church fix the problem and apologize in a robust, meaningful way, and either permanently remove that person from ministry. I mean, that's one of the big things that bothers people, honestly, is this idea that the person could go on and harm others.
Absolutely.
How are you not stopping this person from being able to do or inflict further harm? That really bothers survivors. So if they could see those kinds of measures of justice done, they would be, I don't know if happy is the right word, but there's a level that justice is happening.
Well, and you mentioned there's such a lack of regulation or organizations willing to address and hold accountable. And you mentioned that one of the only stopgap measures that we have right now is to criminalize this behavior.
Absolutely. And that's an area where I think people can spend some time that it actually does matter. So going all the way back to 1990, Minnesota was the first state to actually criminalize this. And it was a therapist, actually, who'd been working with survivors who then said, hey, we've got to do something. And he was really instrumental in making that happen. Really over the past 35 years, we've seen more and more states come online. Over the past decade, we've seen about 4 or 5 more come on. So we have 14 states plus the District of Columbia right now where it's a crime. And these are all state statutes. It's not universal. They don't all look the same. Some are misdemeanors, some are felonies. Some say that it has to happen in the context of counseling.
Right. Yep.
And that it doesn't always occur officially in something that is being labeled as counseling. But that is the place, because there's no state or federal regulation of churches, that then leaves it up to denominations, or if it's an independent church, that local body kind of self-regulating to the extent that it's going to choose to do so. I think what people don't realize that it's truly, the old adage of the Wild West, if you will. It's sort of the old frontier of who knows what's going to happen. Nothing's really set up for churches. Whereas we often think of churches as being structured and organized and well-led. But when it comes to holding abusive leaders accountable, not so much at all. So the stopgap measure then really is at the state level where it becomes a crime. Mm-hmm. And so if it is a crime and someone is convicted of a crime, someone would have a criminal record, even if it's a misdemeanor, you could do a background check and possibly find someone. But Brian, I'll be honest with you. I will say this. I have seen, even in states like Texas, where I am at Baylor University, where it is a crime, I've seen prosecutors fail at kind of the grand jury level to kind of move this forward. I've seen it happen on more than one occasion. And I'm not sure if it's a failure of sort of the DA, the district attorney, and not really knowing how to talk about this in a way that's compelling to the grand jury, or a grand jury just not being sympathetic to a survivor, or kind of understanding of how power actually works in adult relationships and thinking, well, this person's an adult. How could they have actually been abused? I still think we've got a lot of misinformation out there. So we've got a long way to go, but this is an area where people continue to do work and think about it. And I'll be honest also, Brian, sometimes we see resistance from the church itself.
Sure.
We see resistance from the Catholic Church. We see resistance from other clergy members. So when a law is being proposed and a legislator is wanting to sponsor it, sometimes the opposition to it is actually the church itself. And that's what actually talk about sort of the tender heart. That breaks my heart, Brian. Now, I will say, here's some good news. I want to flip it over to the good news side. Over the past 5 years, I have actually seen pastors joining advocates and allies and other people doing work trying to criminalize this. Yeah. I would say this, from 2015 really to 2020, I did not really see pastors in that space. I have seen it over the past 5 years. It doesn't happen as much as I think it could and should, but it is happening. And that's good news, where pastors are saying, absolutely, this should be a crime. Pastors should not be targeting and abusing people in their care. It absolutely should be something that law enforcement can step in and hold someone accountable.
Well, I know in the social work, counseling, therapy, medical spaces, we have really clear guidelines around what constitutes malpractice, negligence, abuse, and like all these scales that just, and then really clear consequences for practitioners who commit any of these things. And there's so little in place for the church, where we still see stuff like this happening all the time.
Yeah. And, I had sort of tipped my hat to that much earlier in that when I was doing my research, I began to look at social work and other allied professions, medicine, psychology, pharmacy, even dentistry, you name it. Sexual relationships with someone in your care is prohibited because it's a dual relationship. It's something that the client or patient would have real difficulty navigating if sex were to be brought into that. And so they're just clearly prohibited. There are people who kind of look at therapist abuse too, in the same way that I look at adult clergy sexual abuse. And not every state has great laws, but far more states have laws around therapists and medical professionals than clergy, for sure. And the other thing, Brian, to add to that, and you kind of alluded to that, is not only are there statutes and laws, but there are boards, right? And that's where regulation steps in. So, for example, in Texas, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I basically am under the heading of the Board of Social Work. So if a client has an issue with me, certainly they can confront me, but if I don't respond well, they can go to that board and report me. And the board has the ability to hold me accountable, question me. They could direct and regulate my practice in a way that they already are not. They could reduce the number of hours I see people. They could even say, you're going to be under supervision, all the way up to, we're actually going to revoke your license and you can't be a social worker anymore. It's that kind of regulation that's completely absent for clergy because of our separation of church and state. We don't have the state or the federal government getting involved in regulating kind of how ministers do their work.
And from my own personal experience, and I've heard from hundreds of other people in these situations, even when they are willing and able to speak to a governing body of some kind, to their denominational, whether at a local or national level, they're just unwilling to do anything about it or to recognize it. Or they say, oh, our hands are tied because this is a voluntary fellowship, so we don't actually have any authority to remove this person. Or it's like, well, you can take away their credentials, you could do this, you could do that, whatever it is. Like you're saying, it's just so difficult for people to get any momentum or to have any sense of justice in these kinds of spaces, which is really hard. Just to be really clear, we're talking a lot, obviously, about clergy sexual abuse. And I think there are so many people who have been gaslit or who've been fed a story of one kind or another saying, well, no, this was a consensual affair or this was a consensual relationship. Would you define for us clergy sexual abuse?
Absolutely. So clergy sexual abuse is really whenever you have a church leader, whether it's an official position or not, but they have power in that system, and that leader misuses that power and their role and their position. They leverage all of that, the trust that's been given to them. They leverage it in ways to start blurring and breaking down boundaries between them and someone that they care for and that's in their care, and erode those boundaries to the point where sexual activity occurs. I will say, sort of adding to the definition, the nuance of it is that this blurring and breaking of boundaries occurs oftentimes over months and sometimes up over a year.
Yeah.
It is these...
Or many years.
Many years, indeed. And I will also say this, on the survivor side, it's often very, very hard to even detect that this is happening. It's hard to know what's happening because most of the time the abuser will frame this as consensual. They frame it as something that's equally being done with them, and that sort of the perpetrator, if you will, is framing the narrative. And so almost every time I talk with a survivor, it takes them a while to understand that they didn't do something wrong, that they were not a willing participant, that their yes, if a yes was even given, was coerced. I'll pivot over a little bit to consent because, as odd as this may be, just say a married pastor wanted to be sexual with someone in his congregation. If that were even a thing that would somehow be okay, that conversation for consent to occur would have to happen every time there was sexual activity, right? Consent isn't just, it's a one and forever. It's every time there's activity. It would have to be a thorough and robust conversation between both people where it was really, really clear both the pastor and the person both wanted that to happen. And I can just tell you from talking with survivors, that never happens. That kind of conversation is not happening. This is secretive, and the people feel pushed and pressured and literally feel backed into a corner. Because one of the things that's really interesting in the dynamics of this is that the abusive pastor makes their person that they're targeting feel indispensable. It's like, God has brought you into my world, into my life, into this church, and without you, I can't do this well. I mean, they really do target the person and make them feel that saying no or not being their supporter is a problem. Like you're not doing God's will almost if you back away or set a boundary. And so once then a sexual actual boundary is crossed, it's so hard. Like, is this part of what I'm supposed to be doing?
Right.
Literally survivors have told me, and literally they'll use the word, I felt crazy. Kind of in the last few months of the abuse, it just felt like there were two people. I don't know what's going on. I don't know up from down, left from right. I cannot make sense of what's happening. And in part because they've been gaslit so much to
Sure.
believe that being sexual with their pastor is somehow okay. Because I can tell you, almost every time the pastor is framing this is somehow either God is okay with this completely and God has sanctioned this relationship, but and I've certainly heard it well, maybe this isn't what God wants, but God's grace is so amazing. God forgives us. In other words, it's okay to keep doing this. And so literally the person being targeted is literally, you can understand in a sense why this is crazy making. Like, wow, it's okay to be sexual with my pastor? I guess so, because they're telling me, and they've been telling me this for months. And so, it's really an insidious form of abuse. So once someone kind of awakens to what has happened and is coming out of this, the betrayal obviously is profound.
Well, I think of the word grooming as you're talking about this long process of weeks, months, or even years of slowly breaking down these barriers. And you talk about sexual activity or contact. I mean, it can be text messages, it can be comments, it can be the way that you look or the thing that you're wearing or thought I had a crazy dream about you last night. And I know it means nothing, but I just, whatever. And it just gets so blurry and it is so crazy making. And I appreciate that you say that you recognize how long it takes for people, especially in those last months, to recognize that the trauma was not their fault.
Yeah, I wish it were not so hard, but I think part of it is we're living in sort of the pressure, the gravitational pressure on us in religious spaces. So many of us have been socialized to trust our leaders.
For sure.
Right? And so that's what the person's doing all the way through is I'm trusting you, I'm trusting you, I'm trusting you. And that's what's the crazy making is this doesn't feel right, it doesn't seem right, and yet I'm trusting you and you're saying it's okay. And I will say many, many perpetrators do begin, if there's ever a sense that the person might speak up or say something, that's when you often see a lot of fault finding and blaming, even from the perpetrator. You've done this, you were a part of this with me. And even if they're not fully blaming, if you will, the survivor for the abuse itself, which some do that, they're certainly blaming them. If it gets found out, this will all hang on you. If there's people who leave the faith or whose faiths get shipwrecked or, it's your fault. So there's this enormous pressure of, even though we're now at a place where we're starting to call this wrong and I might want to say something, I can't because I'm then going to be responsible for the church going off the rails. That's almost the way it's sort of framed for them. Whatever negative outcomes occur from here on out, if it happens, and it's because you said something, that's on you. That's on you.
Yeah. And like you said, it is insidious and it is crippling for survivors to go through. And you mentioned the power dynamic, and I want to be careful because we're saying pastors a lot, but it's as simple as an 18-year-old youth leader who has been talking to this 15-year-old girl at youth group for months, weeks, years, and just waiting for the day. I know personally stories of how many youth leaders and youth pastors just waited until that young person turns 18 to get engaged or married or whatever it is. And you've been watching this relationship over months and years sometimes. Or sometimes it's the Sunday school teacher or the small group leader or the, whoever it is. It's not always a staff member. It's not always the senior pastor. If there is any kind of power differential at play, there isn't that room for consent, for true consent.
Yeah, I think you're spot on that anytime there's a power differential in play, if consent is going to be obtained, it's going to be a highly complex and nuanced process that in a church setting, for example, it might even involve an intermediary to actually mediate that power differential to make sure that the person is really saying yes. And I wanted to actually affirm something you were just getting at. One of the people I interviewed, and it wasn't in that 27, but it was shortly thereafter, she had reached out and I had done an interview with her and gathered some data. And she said, I'm married to my abuser. And because I'm married, she said the entire sort of process of how I got involved, I was groomed, I was targeted, I was abused, and I ended up marrying them. And no one will call it abuse. No one will see it that way. but it ended up happening. So I guess all I'm saying is sometimes there are relationships that look normal, normal
Yeah.
married relationship here, that actually it was a version of adult clergy sexual abuse.
Yeah. Well, and we've normalized it in the church. We have like hero stories of a very well-known pastor who met his wife at church camp when she was a minor. And he was, I think, a counselor or whatever it was. And they're living this wonderful, happy marriage. And isn't God wonderful and all these things? So we're normalizing this behavior too, when we should be calling it out as, no, actually, this is very wrong. And we need to beware of these kinds of things because they keep happening.
Right.
So for our listeners who maybe know or unfortunately are just realizing that what they've experienced is some form of clergy sexual abuse, do you have any recommendations or really practical steps that they can take for themselves?
Yes. I mean, the first thing I would say is if there's a part of you feeling crazy at all and you're not, trust yourself, begin to trust your intuitions, trust what you know. Your body knows. You know more than you may think you know. That's the first thing. And I would say, too, there is help. There are resources. If the survivors are Catholic, there's a resource called Awake. It used to be called Awake Milwaukee, but now it's called Awake. And it's great. You don't only have to be a Catholic to do that. There's another kind of grassroots survivor kind of organization called RVC, Restored Voices Collective. Primarily, I wouldn't say it's only for Protestants, but it's primarily Protestants who are part of that community. But these have both emerged over the past 5 years. And both of them involve both kind of some survivors and professionals kind of helping guide and lead both of those organizations. But it's a place where you can be believed and heard and understood. That's what I would say are my first stops for a survivor. If you're beginning to like, hey, what is going on here?
That's
those
very
are some
helpful.
good stops.
Thank you. I want to end on a happier note. Obviously, this is an extremely difficult conversation and topic to have, but also your research shows a high level of resiliency. And for those who responded that they are healing or getting better, do you have an idea of what healing has looked like for them? Are there patterns, habits, behaviors you can see or identify, or just anything you want to share about what your research showed there?
Yes. So it's a combination of what I learned from that. And I wanted to learn how people get better and why people are resilient. And I created a resilience index. And so the primary predictor of resilience, believe it or not, and it was counterintuitive to me, I did not expect this, was faith in God. But what we learned in the research is this is faith in God that is disconnected from the institution.
Yes.
So that is a big part of healing, is deconstructing and pulling apart my God conception from the institution. And I know for many people, varying levels of fusion of that, but pulling that apart is a really important piece. One of the things that showed up in my research on resilience, what is it that you needed? What helped you heal the most? And this is going to sound strange, Brian, because I don't know how to articulate it beyond what I'm going to say, but they wanted a more human church. They wanted leaders that were more human, their peers that were more human, and more permission to express their own humanity.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know exactly how to operationalize that or define that adequately, but that really stood out to me as something that really mattered to these survivors. Another big predictor is actually getting professional counseling from a trained therapist. And so anyone who has experienced this, that is really important. And I would say, and I can't say that pastoral care within a church setting is unhelpful. All I can tell you is the survivors that I was talking to saying that's not the route. I didn't want to go that route. I really needed help outside of the space where the injuries had occurred.
Thank you. And I get that question a lot. Certifications or boards are so much state by state. Do you have a recommendation for where people can go find a therapist or a counselor or professional help wherever they are?
That's a great question. And one of the things I would like to work on is actually kind of a list of competent, capable therapists who are trained to deal with religious and spiritual issues. Brian, maybe it's my bias toward everyone who's professionally trained, but I honestly think any social worker, not any, but, because they're not, everyone's perfect, but social workers, psychologists, licensed professional counselors, anyone who's sort of trained in that area, you can even just do Google searches for therapists in my local area. As a trauma therapist, I'm EMDR trained. So anything through EMDRIA, EMDRIA, you can go to that website and find an EMDR trained therapist in your local area. There are several organizations now that are training people around religious trauma and spiritual abuse. And I can't even sort of off the top of my head list those websites, but there are a couple. And some of those are able to start kind of pointing you in the direction of people who've gotten their certifications. Okay. Again, having those certifications doesn't mean for sure that they're going to be better.
Right.
I wish I had a better response to your question, because it's a really good one. We're not at the place where we really have sort of a clearinghouse of, here are the therapists who can do really great work in this area of spiritual and religious trauma, specifically adult clergy sexual abuse. And I do get questions a lot. Do you know a therapist in North Carolina who does this or whatever? I'm like, no.
Yeah, I get the same question all the time.
Yeah, I don't.
Like, sorry.
I'm so sorry. Yeah. And so I think that hopefully in the next decade, we'll make some progress in that area.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Do you have time for one last question?
Absolutely.
Or do you need to go?
Oh, yeah. No, I'm good.
I love to get nerdy about data.
Okay.
Is there a data point that you've been sitting on or particularly excited about that you don't often share other places?
That's a good one. No. Honestly, no. There's,
That's okay.
There's nothing kind of sitting in the wings that I haven't really... I'm trying to think. This question's a good one because my brain is going back to the survey and I'm thinking in my data set, is there something...
Well, or I'm wondering, as you prepare to do this next survey,
sure. Yes,
is there something particularly interesting to you that you're looking for or hoping for as you formulate questions and all that stuff?
Yeah, some of the areas where I've dug in a little bit more is I'm interested in how are people coping. So I have similar questions to kind of do like a study where I have a data point 10 years ago, and now it's not longitudinal in the sense that I have the exact same respondents, but I have questions that deal with coping. And by coping, I really am talking about sort of passive coping, like substance use, compulsive sexual behaviors, eating, compulsive exercising, things around that. So I have many more questions to better assess the relationship with those kinds of things with the experience. And something I learned, unfortunately, Brian, after doing the interviews that I didn't include in the survey is honestly how often suicidal ideation or thinking or thoughts co-occur with this kind of trauma. And so I have now included some of those variables in. The third piece that's now in this new research package that I'm working on focuses on institutional betrayal, very specifically by including Jennifer Freyd's actual instrument that she uses to collect data around that. So those are three kind of low-hanging fruit things that I can immediately think of off the top of my head that are now included in this next data set. One of the other things that I will say, and it's not necessarily the data, like what I'm capturing, it's how I'm capturing it. I did have a midpoint in the last survey where it was neither agree nor disagree. And I'm going to push respondents off of a middle point because I noticed that people, and I think out of their ambivalence and not wanting to, I don't know what to say here. A lot of people pick that midpoint. Yeah. And I'm going to move them off the top of being able to pick a midpoint. You're either going to agree or disagree in some nuanced way, right? With the statements. So I think I'll have more clarity there by not giving people an out of a midpoint, because I know people have a lot of ambivalence.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Dr. Pooler, thank you so much for your time. I so appreciate the work that you're doing and where it's getting shared. People can hear you on the All the Buried Women podcast. I know you spoke recently at the Restory conference. I listened to that talk as well with Julie Royce. Where else, if people want to connect with you or find your work, where can they go? Yeah, so that's the other thing. Because I'm an academic, I don't sort of make my and that's okay too. World right out in the sort of the Instagram and X world and Facebook, but you can find me, and I will occasionally post things there.
But at the Garland School of Social Work, if you do look up the Adult Clergy Sexual Abuse Advocacy and Research Collaborative, you will find some information there on some of the data points that we've talked about today, some up-to-date pieces where I may have been interviewed for a media story or a podcast or whatever. So just trying to kind of keep people in the loop there. I'm out here and I always respond to people. So if you want to find me just at Baylor and email me, you can find me there pretty easily at david_pooler@baylor.edu. I'm pretty responsive.
Yeah, you responded to me and I appreciate it. It's where we found that email signature and everything else. David, thank you again so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
My goodness, what a rich conversation. I learned so much. I'm so grateful for Dr. Pooler and his work, which is really providing not just language, but validation through his research and data for so many who've experienced clergy sexual abuse. And again, if this is something that you have experienced, I am so sorry. This was not your fault, and it should never have happened. You can find links to all the things that we reference in the show notes. Next time, we'll be talking with Michael Cusick from Restoring the Soul about his newest book, Sacred Attachment. Subscribe or follow the show to get new episodes automatically. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review or share with your friends. As a 501c3 nonprofit, our work is made possible by our generous donors. If this has been helpful to you, consider joining us today at brokentobeloved.org/support. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to listen. I hope it's been helpful. Here's to moving toward healing and wholeness together. I'll see you next time.